On a chilly morning in Washington, D.C., James Carter, an 82-year-old black veteran of the U.S. military, arrived at the National Military History Museum, a place that was meant to honor the sacrifices of all those who served. But when he approached the entrance, a museum employee turned him away, claiming the museum was closed for a private event, despite other visitors being allowed in. James, dressed in his veteran's uniform, stood outside, stunned and humiliated. He had given so much to his country, fought in wars, and carried the weight of a lifetime of service. Yet here he was denied entry to a place that was supposed to remember him. Without hesitation, James pulled out his phone and dialed the number he had never thought he'd need to call, the number to the president's office. "I've been denied access to the museum, and I need someone to listen," he said, his voice unwavering. "This isn't just about me. It's about all the veterans who've been ignored." Within hours of James's phone call, the response from the president's office came. A staff member called him back, apologizing for what had happened and assuring him that someone would be sent to meet with him immediately. Later that afternoon, two men in dark suits arrived at James's home. They introduced themselves as representatives from the Department of Veterans Affairs. One of them, a man in his mid-40s, looked at James with empathy in his eyes. "Mr. Carter, we're deeply sorry for the way you were treated," he said. "We've been instructed to look into this incident and ensure something like this doesn't happen again." James nodded, not out of gratitude, but out of necessity. This wasn't just about the rejection at the museum. It was about a larger issue that had plagued him and many others over the years, being overlooked, ignored, and made invisible despite years of service to a country that claimed to honor its heroes. That evening, the story made headlines. News outlets from across the country began covering the incident, calling it an example of racial bias and the ongoing struggles black veterans faced in the U.S. Military Museum, a place supposedly dedicated to all who served, yet excluding them from its halls. The following day, the museum's director publicly apologized in a press conference, promising to revisit their policies and improve training for staff. James was invited back to the museum for a special ceremony, but he didn't show. He had already made his point. His voice had been heard. But the ripple effect was undeniable. Veterans groups across the country rallied, and many shared their own stories of discrimination and neglect. The issue wasn't confined to a single museum. It was part of a much larger conversation about race, service, and recognition in America. The phone rang early the next morning. James wasn't surprised anymore by the constant media attention. He had received interview requests from major news outlets, and even some podcasts wanted to feature his story. But this call was different. "Mr. Carter, I'm calling on behalf of the President's office. The President has personally requested to meet with you to discuss the impact of your story and the next steps." The voice on the other end was calm, but there was an undeniable urgency. James leaned back in his chair, his fingers tightening around the receiver. He had never expected this. Never imagined that a simple act of standing up for himself would lead to the President of the United States wanting to speak with him directly. But then again, maybe it wasn't so simple. Maybe this moment was about something far larger than one man's experience. The following week, James was flown to Washington, D.C. for a private meeting at the White House. As he walked into the Oval Office, his heart was calm, his resolve steady. He had seen war, hardship, and pain, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. President William Harris stood up from behind his desk and extended his hand. "Mr. Carter, thank you for coming. I've read your story, and I'm deeply moved by your courage." James shook his hand firmly, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He didn't come here to be praised. He didn't come to be a symbol of anything. He came to ensure that the treatment he had faced would never happen to another veteran again. The president motioned for him to sit, and they spent the next hour talking. James shared his story not just about the rejection at the museum, but about the larger struggles that Black veterans had faced throughout history, how they fought in wars that didn't always fight for them in return, how they were often left behind when it came to recognition, healthcare, and support. When James finished speaking, the room was silent. The president, for the first time, was speechless. Finally, President Harris spoke. "We can't undo the past, Mr. Carter, but we can make sure this never happens again. I'm making it a priority to address the systemic issues facing Black veterans. We'll begin by forming a task force to examine the experiences of minorities in the military and make the necessary changes." James nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction. His fight wasn't over, but it had made an impact. His voice, once just a whisper in the crowd, had grown louder, and now it was echoing through the halls of power. Over the next few months, several initiatives were launched in response to James's story. Veterans organizations worked alongside the government to ensure more equitable treatment for all service members. The National Military History Museum created a new exhibit dedicated to underrepresented groups in military service, showcasing stories of Black, Latino, Native American, and other minority veterans who had often been erased from the narrative. James Carter, however, returned to his quiet life. He wasn't one for fame or public recognition, but his actions had sparked something bigger. He continued to spend his days in his small home, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee, knowing that change was happening, even if it wasn't always visible right away. And as for the museum, they sent him an invitation to visit again. But this time, they made sure to extend the invitation in a way that he could never be turned away. Several months passed, and James continued his daily routine. Quiet mornings, long walks, and phone calls with old friends. But something had changed within him. The quiet satisfaction of knowing that his voice had been heard was powerful. Yet there was still a part of him that longed for a deeper, lasting transformation. One afternoon, he received an invitation in the mail. It was from the National Military History Museum. This time, it wasn't a rejection. It was a personal invitation, signed by the director himself. The museum was unveiling a new wing dedicated to the stories of Black veterans, and they wanted James Carter to be their guest of honor at the opening ceremony. For the first time in years, James put on his military uniform again, carefully buttoning it, smoothing out the wrinkles that time had created. He looked at himself in the mirror. Not just the soldier, but the man who had seen so much, endured so much, and now stood as a witness to a changing world. When he arrived at the museum that evening, the atmosphere was different. The air felt lighter, filled with recognition, respect, and acknowledgement. The new exhibit was moving. It told the stories of soldiers like him, Black men and women who had fought for their country, despite the country not always fighting for them. Their stories were now front and center, in the place where they had long been overlooked. As James stood before the exhibit, watching the faces of visitors as they took in the new displays, a young woman approached him. She was in her 20s, a student studying history. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "I just wanted to say thank you. My grandfather served in World War II, and he never talked about his experiences because he felt like no one cared. But seeing this exhibit, I think he would have felt seen. Thank you for giving a voice to people like him." James smiled, the weight of his years lifting for just a moment. "It wasn't just me," he said. "It was all of us. And sometimes all it takes is one person to speak up." Later that evening, the museum director stood beside James, his voice filled with gratitude. We can't undo the past, Mr. Carter, but your courage has changed the future, and for that we are forever grateful." James simply nodded, content. He had done what he set out to do, not for fame, not for recognition, but for justice. And now his story, along with the stories of so many others, was finally being told in the halls that had once turned them away. As the evening ended, James walked out of the museum, slowly, his cane tapping against the pavement. He could hear the voices of people still inside, discussing the exhibits, their faces lit with understanding. He felt a deep sense of peace. He had fought many battles in his life, both on the front lines and against the quiet battles of racism and neglect. But in the end, he had won a different kind of victory, the kind that doesn't come with medals or ceremonies, but with a legacy that would live on for generations. The fight for respect, for recognition, for equality, it wasn't over, but it had taken a significant step forward. And James Carter, the man who had once been turned away, had made sure of that.